The sun was setting on a crisp autumn day when Judge Thomas O'Malley made a decision that would change the course of many lives. The courtroom, once a place of respect and order, now felt like a theater of injustice. In the silence that followed his gavel strike, a heavy weight descended upon everyone present. The young man standing in the dock, 17-year-old Marcus Lewis, looked bewildered, his hands trembling as he stood before the judge. Despite the evidence of his innocence, despite his unwavering alibi and the support of his family and friends, Marcus had been found guilty of a crime he didn't commit. The courtroom murmured, eyes filled with disbelief, yet no one dared challenge the authority of Judge O'Malley. The case was a simple one, or so it seemed. Marcus had been accused of a robbery that occurred late one night in a small convenience store. The store's security footage, which had been tampered with, was all the prosecution needed to secure a conviction. In reality, Marcus had been miles away at home, helping his mother with a broken-down car, but the judge, influenced by his own prejudices, was determined to find him guilty. O'Malley had always prided himself on his strict interpretations of the law, but beneath that veneer of legal righteousness, a dark bias lingered, one that Marcus, though just a teenager, had seen in the judge's cold, calculating eyes. As the judge read the verdict aloud, the weight of it pressed down on Marcus's chest like a ton of bricks. "Guilty," O'Malley said, his voice stone cold. The word echoed throughout the courtroom. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Marcus's mother, sitting in the front row, broke down in tears. The prosecutor barely suppressed a grin, while the defense attorney stood in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to such an unjust verdict. The gallery remained eerily still, the tension palpable in the air. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, his future seemingly erased in a moment. The courtroom doors slammed shut behind him, leaving behind a haunting silence that lingered long after the judge had left the bench. What no one knew, what no one could have predicted, was that this moment, this very decision, would be the catalyst for a chain of events that would not only alter Marcus's life, but would come to haunt the judge and his family years later. As Marcus was ushered to the holding cell, the community outside the courthouse began to stir. Word of the trial's outcome spread like wildfire through town. Some were angry, others resigned, but all were deeply unsettled. People who had known Marcus since he was a boy couldn't fathom how the judge had failed to see the truth. The whispers of injustice grew louder, but there was nothing anyone could do. The wheels of the legal system were in motion, and it seemed like nothing could stop them. But Marcus was not going to be another casualty of a broken system. In the darkest moment of his life, he made a silent vow to himself. He would fight, no matter what it took, to prove his innocence. The road ahead would be long and fraught with hardship, but he would not go quietly. And little did he know, his fight for justice would soon bring a much more personal reckoning for the man who had sentenced him. Judge O'Malley, however, was oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. As he retired to his home that evening, the weight of his decision didn't press on him. He was certain that he had made the right call, justified by the law. He didn't see the subtle shift in the air, the quiet murmur of resentment beginning to grow in the community, or the creeping sense that his world was about to change forever. What he didn't know was that the very people who had once revered him were beginning to question his judgment. They had seen enough of his decisions to know that his gavel wasn't always guided by fairness. But most crucially, they hadn't yet learned the truth of his own personal biases, the truth that would come to light in ways they couldn't yet understand. As the days passed, Marcus's name became synonymous with injustice in the town. The young man who had once been known for his quiet demeanor and humble nature was now the face of a broken system. His story spread across local news outlets, sparking protests, petitions, and public outcry. People rallied around Marcus, demanding that his case be reopened. But the legal system, wrapped in layers of bureaucracy and slow-moving justice, appeared to offer little hope. It seemed that the only way for Marcus to reclaim his future would be to take matters into his own hands. For the O'Malley family, Life continued on with a sense of normalcy, though an undercurrent of tension began to build. Judge O'Malley's daughter, Emily, had never fully understood the weight of her father's career until now. Growing up in the shadow of his authoritative figure, she had always seen him as a man who was right in every decision he made, a paragon of the law. But now, as the public outcry grew louder, she started to feel the weight of her father's choices. People were no longer whispering their admiration for Judge O'Malley. They were whispering about his decisions, his biases, and the consequences of his actions. Emily felt like the walls were closing in around her. But in the midst of all this, she remained unaware of how deeply her father's mistake would affect her own life. The community's disdain for the judge didn't just target him. It would soon reach her as well. The chains of her father's actions would bind her in ways she never anticipated. Yet, as the story would soon reveal, the true cost of O'Malley's decision would not be borne by him alone, but by his own family. The path to justice for Marcus was only just beginning, but the ripples from that fateful day were about to spread far wider than anyone could have imagined. Months passed, and the town's discontent simmered beneath the surface. Marcus had been sentenced to 10 years in prison, though his conviction was a hollow one. The whispers of injustice continued to spread like wildfire, gaining momentum with every passing week. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, the town's judicial system seemed unshaken, steadfast in its belief that the verdict had been fair. However, for Emily O'Malley, life in her father's house was far from serene. The weight of her father's decisions hung heavily in the air. Emily had always admired her father, Judge Thomas O'Malley, the epitome of power, respect, and authority in their small town. She had grown up with stories of his fairness, his unyielding commitment to the law, and his unwavering belief in the justice system. To her, he was a man who never made mistakes, a man who was always right, who held the scales of justice in his hands like an unshakable force. But now, that image was beginning to crack. The people who had once greeted her father with deference now looked at him with suspicion. Whispers filled the streets, from the local diner to the front steps of the courthouse. People spoke of his harsh rulings, of how the town seemed to be split into two groups: those who stood by him no matter the cost, and those who wondered how they had been so blind to his faults. Emily noticed the glances, the hushed tones when her name was mentioned. She was no longer seen as just the judge's daughter. She was now a symbol of the corruption people believed he embodied. At first, Emily tried to ignore the murmurs, believing that things would eventually return to normal, that the controversy would fade. But then came the letters. Anonymous notes, simple phrases, accusations written in cold, sterile ink. Your father ruined his life. Will he ruin yours too? They read. At first, they were easy to dismiss as the work of someone with too much time on their hands. But then the phone calls started. Strange, silent calls in the middle of the night, staring eyes in the grocery store. People she once called friends now avoiding her in the street. The isolation grew until it felt suffocating. One afternoon, while Emily was sitting in her father's study, the walls adorned with law books and framed awards, she realized the extent to which her life had changed. Her father's face, normally stern and commanding, looked exhausted as he sat across from her. His once proud demeanor had dulled under the pressure of the growing unrest. Emily had always admired his strength, but now she saw the cracks in his armor. She watched as he sank lower into his chair, his mind constantly occupied by the swirling storm of controversy that surrounded him. "You know it's all lies, don't you?" he said, his voice low, the words heavy with weariness. "I don't know anymore, Dad," Emily replied quietly, the weight of his words sinking deep within her. "People don't see you the way they used to. They're questioning everything you've done. What's worse, they're questioning me too." Her father's silence spoke volumes. He couldn't bring himself to deny the truth, not when it was so clear to everyone but him. Emily had long suspected that her father's choices, especially in the case of Marcus Lewis, were guided more by bias than by the law. The rumors about Marcus's innocence had become too loud to ignore. Every day, it seemed, Someone else came forward, claiming to know something that would prove his innocence. But Judge O'Malley had refused to listen, holding firm to his belief that he had made the right call. Still, Emily could not fully reconcile the man she once admired with the person who had sentenced an innocent boy to prison. Marcus, who had been an unassuming teenager, had no motive to commit the crime he was accused of. Everyone who knew him swore that he had been at home that night, yet the judge's bias had rendered their testimony irrelevant. Emily had been blind to it all, as had everyone else who believed in her father's impeccable judgment. The events surrounding Marcus's trial were beginning to unravel the O'Malley family from the inside out. Emily had once enjoyed a life filled with social events, gala dinners, and quiet family dinners in their spacious home. Now she spent most of her time at work, hiding from the stares and avoiding the gossip. The town that had once adored her father now felt hostile, like a foreign place she no longer belonged to. But it wasn't just the public eye that was weighing on her. At night, Emily lay awake, replaying the events in her mind. She remembered her father's stern face when he had passed the sentence. She thought of Marcus, of his young face twisted in confusion, his innocence stripped away by a man who had let his biases guide him. And she thought of the moment when Marcus's mother had broken down in court. The raw, guttural cries of a mother watching her son's future disintegrate in front of her had haunted Emily for days. The truth was inescapable. Her father had made a grave mistake. Emily knew it deep down, even though she struggled to admit it to herself. She had been too close to him, too involved in the world he had built around his role as judge, to see the biases that had skewed his perception. One day, while walking home from work, Emily encountered an old childhood friend, Jasmine. They had known each other since grade school. Their families had always been close. But now, as they exchanged pleasantries, Emily saw the flicker of discomfort in Jasmine's eyes. It wasn't just the recent controversy that caused the distance between them. It was something deeper, something Emily couldn't quite put her finger on. "Emily, I don't know how to say this," Jasmine began, hesitating. "But people are saying some things about your father. They're saying Marcus was innocent, and they're saying he wasn't the only one." The words hit Emily like a punch to the gut. She felt her breath catch in her throat. "What do you mean? What do you mean he wasn't the only one?" Jasmine looked around, as if making sure no one was listening. "There are others, Emily. People your father sentenced in similar circumstances. People who didn't deserve what happened to them. I don't know all the details, but I've heard the rumors. People are starting to talk. I'm not the only one who's noticed." Emily's world tilted. The rumors, the whispers, everything she had brushed off for months, suddenly felt so much more real. Marcus's case was no isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger picture, a picture she wasn't sure she was ready to see. As Emily walked back to the house that evening, her mind raced. She had always trusted her father. She had always believed in his righteousness. But now, with the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, she couldn't deny that something much darker was at play. The world she had once known was beginning to crumble, and there was no way she could ignore the truth any longer. The ripple effects of her father's actions were now hitting closer to home than she ever thought possible. She didn't know where this would all lead, but one thing was certain: her life was about to change forever. As weeks turned into months, Emily found herself drowning in a sea of conflicting emotions. The weight of her father's decisions bore down on her more with each passing day. She had been raised to respect the law above all else, to believe that the truth would always prevail. But now, as her father's reputation unraveled and Marcus's case continued to stir the community, she couldn't escape the gnawing feeling in her gut that something was deeply wrong. Every time she went to work, she was met with cold stares and whispered comments from her colleagues. The once warm office had transformed into a place where eyes followed her every move, the unspoken words more suffocating than any accusation. She couldn't bring herself to confront her father. The man she had once admired so deeply now seemed like a stranger to her. She had grown up watching him make decisions with unwavering confidence, and yet, With every new revelation about Marcus's innocence, the facade of that confidence began to crack. Emily found herself questioning everything she had believed about justice, fairness, and her own role in it all. She had always thought of herself as a quiet bystander, someone who merely existed in her father's world. But now, as the anger and frustration from the community reached new heights, she was no longer able to remain on the sidelines. She knew that there was only one way to find peace. She had to confront her father. She had to make him see what he had done, had to force him to confront the consequences of his actions. But how could she do that? How could she, his daughter, stand up against the very foundation of his life, the one he had built for decades? The fear of what such a confrontation might mean paralyzed her, but at the same time, she knew she had no choice. The community wasn't going to forget, and neither would she. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emily found herself sitting across from her father in their quiet, dimly lit dining room. The house was eerily silent, the usual hum of conversation replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Her father sat at the head of the table, his hands resting on the polished wood, staring at the surface as if it held the answers to all the questions that had been plaguing him for months. Emily could see the toll this whole situation had taken on him. His once pristine appearance had become disheveled, his hair graying prematurely, and the lines on his face had deepened. He looked older now, tired, like a man who had seen too much and understood too little. "Dad," Emily began, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "We need to talk." He didn't look up immediately, but when he did, there was a mixture of exhaustion and weariness in his eyes. "What's on your mind, Emily?" His voice was low, almost too calm, as if he already knew what was coming. "You know I've been hearing things," she said softly, trying to steady her breath. "About Marcus, about the case, and about what people are saying about you." Judge O'Malley shifted in his seat, a flash of irritation crossing his face, before he quickly masked it with his usual stern demeanor. "People will say whatever they want. I did what I thought was right." "I know," Emily replied. "But what if you were wrong? What if Marcus didn't deserve what happened to him? What if he was innocent?" Her father's eyes hardened at the question. He had heard the murmurs, the accusations from the community, but he had refused to believe them. To accept that he had made a mistake was to unravel everything he had built over the course of his career. He had always believed that his rulings were just, that the law was the law, and that he was a mere vessel for it. But now, as his daughter challenged him, doubt crept into his mind for the first time in years. "You're not listening to me, Emily," he snapped, his voice rising. "I followed the law. It wasn't about what I thought of Marcus. It was about the evidence in front of me. The law doesn't bend for sentimentality." Emily felt a chill run through her. "But the evidence was wrong, Dad. The footage, the witnesses, it was all manipulated. You knew it wasn't right, and yet you sentenced him anyway." Her father's face went pale. He leaned back in his chair, as though the words had physically struck him. "That's not true," he whispered, his voice faltering for the first time in years. "I did what I had to do." "No, Dad," Emily said, her voice gaining strength. "You did what you wanted to do. You let your personal biases cloud your judgment. Marcus didn't deserve this. He's been fighting for years, trying to prove his innocence. And now you're ruining everything we've worked for. You've ruined everything, and I don't know if I can keep living in this lie." For the first time in months, Emily saw her father's shield begin to crack. His gaze dropped to the table again, and the silence that followed was heavy with years of unspoken truths. He knew she was right, but admitting it would mean the collapse of everything he had ever known. It would mean facing the reality that his legacy, his life's work, had been built on a flawed foundation. The man who had prided himself on fairness and justice had betrayed his own principles. The truth, as bitter and painful as it was, would destroy him. "I don't know what to do, Emily," he said quietly, his voice barely audible. She could see the raw pain in his eyes, the self-loathing that he had buried deep within himself for so long. It was the first time she had seen him truly vulnerable. "You have to do what's right, Dad. For once in your life, you have to admit you were wrong. For Marcus, for me, for everyone you've hurt." There was a long pause, and Emily held her breath, waiting for her father to respond. For a moment, she thought he might stand up and walk away, retreating into his old, inflexible self. But then, something changed. Slowly, painfully, Judge O'Malley placed his hands on the table and looked up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I don't know if I can fix it, Emily," he said, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I don't know how to make it right." Emily didn't have an answer for him, but for the first time, she believed that her father might understand. The truth wasn't something that could be erased with a ruling or a quick fix. But maybe, just maybe, admitting the truth was the first step toward redemption, for him, for Marcus, and for their broken community. The road ahead would be long and fraught with more pain, but it was the only path that could lead to healing. The question now was whether they were both ready to walk it. As the conversation ended, Emily left the table, her mind filled with uncertainty. Her father's acknowledgement of his mistake was not enough to erase the damage, but it was a start. She didn't know how much longer she could hold onto her faith in the man who had raised her, but she did know one thing. She could no longer remain silent. The time had come for her to make a choice, and that choice would define not just her future, but the future of the man she had once called a hero. The days that followed the conversation between Emily and her father felt like an endless, slow burn. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if the universe was patiently waiting for the moment when all the unresolved tensions would finally explode. Emily found herself oscillating between a strange sense of hope and an overwhelming weight of despair. She had confronted her father, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were teetering on the edge of something much bigger than either of them could control. Her father had begun to question the actions that had defined his career, but now she had to face the brutal truth. It was too late to undo the damage. Meanwhile, Marcus's case had taken on a life of its own. After years of fighting for justice, he had found new allies in the form of civil rights organizations, journalists, and a growing wave of local activists who had rallied behind his cause. The story had gained national attention, turning Marcus from a quiet teenager into the face of systemic injustice. His fight for freedom had now become a symbol of the deep-seated corruption in the very system that was supposed to protect him. What had started as a quiet town's tragedy had now spread beyond its borders, forcing everyone involved to confront the uncomfortable truth about their roles in perpetuating that injustice. Marcus had been speaking out for months now, his voice growing louder with every new development. Every time he told his story, he gained more supporters, more momentum. His innocence was no longer in question. The case was becoming impossible to ignore. Marcus had always been a survivor, and in the face of overwhelming odds, he had found a way to turn his pain into something powerful. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, surrounded by hardship, but none of it had prepared him for the way the legal system would fail him. The years he spent in prison had hardened him in ways no one could have imagined. But what most people didn't know was that Marcus wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by the system, for every soul who had ever been cast aside, simply because they didn't have the power to fight back. And now his time had come. One evening, as the town simmered with anger and anticipation, Marcus was granted an unexpected breakthrough. New evidence had surfaced, key testimony from a prison inmate who had witnessed the true culprit's confession. The evidence was irrefutable, and the courts had no choice but to reopen the case. In a turn of events that stunned the community, Marcus was granted a retrial. The momentum was on his side, and for the first time in years, he could feel the walls of his prison cell cracking. He knew that his moment had arrived, but it was also a moment of reckoning for the people who had wronged him, most notably Judge O'Malley. For Judge O'Malley, the weight of the coming storm was almost unbearable. He could feel the pressure building. His career was on the line, and he knew it. His past decisions were being scrutinized with a fine-toothed comb, each one dissected and questioned. The very foundation of his life was crumbling beneath him, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Every legal expert, every member of the community who had once held him in high regard, was now looking at him as if he were a criminal himself. His pride, the thing he had held closest for so many years, had become his greatest weakness. One evening, Judge O'Malley received a call that would change everything. It was from the district attorney's office, and it was official. Marcus Lewis' conviction had been overturned. The retrial had found him not guilty, and his wrongful sentence was now being rectified. There was no more room for denial, no more space to hide behind the law. The facts were clear, and the truth was undeniable. The judge sat in his office long into the night, staring at the walls that had once held all of his awards and accolades. The room, once a symbol of his power, now felt suffocating. Emily had been by his side, watching in silence as her father grappled with the weight of his past decisions. She had always believed in him, but now the truth lay bare between them, a chasm too wide to ignore. "Dad," Emily said quietly, her voice soft but steady. "You can't hide from this anymore. It's done. You need to face what you've done." Her words hung in the air, and for the first time in his life, Judge O'Malley found himself unable to respond. He had always been a man of action, of clear decisions. But now, in the face of his own mistakes, he was paralyzed. The man who had wielded the law as a weapon felt helpless, as if the very rules he had once used to dominate others had turned against him. As the days passed and the trial date loomed closer, the tension in the town reached a boiling point. People gathered in the streets, outside the courthouse, outside the O'Malley family's house. The town, once so tightly knit, was now a battleground. The divisions were clear. The community that had once looked up to the judge now turned its gaze on him with condemnation. And in the midst of it all stood Emily, the daughter of the man who had sentenced an innocent boy to prison, trying to find her own place in a world that had changed so drastically. Emily knew that the day of reckoning was fast approaching. She had spent so much of her life sheltered from the reality of her father's work, protected by the blind faith she had always had in him. But now, the truth was unavoidable, and the cost of silence was too high. The community demanded answers, and the time for excuses was long gone. But even as she prepared for the inevitable fallout, a part of her couldn't help but wonder, could this moment truly be the end? Could one mistake, one injustice, ruin everything? On the eve of the retrial, Marcus stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, the weight of years pressing down on him. He had endured so much, fought so long, and now it was all coming to a head. His victory wasn't just a personal one. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been silenced by the system, for every person who had ever been crushed under the weight of a broken system of justice. As the doors of the courthouse opened the next morning, the air was thick with anticipation. People gathered, waiting for the trial to begin, for the moment when justice would finally be served. Emily, standing by her father's side, couldn't help but wonder, when the dust settled, would they both be able to look at each other in the eyes again, knowing that they had both been irrevocably changed by the events that had transpired? In the courtroom, Marcus finally found himself standing where he had always belonged, on the side of truth. As the judge prepared to enter, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. It wasn't just a trial anymore. It was the trial of a community's soul, of a system's integrity, and of the very fabric of justice itself. The questions had been asked, the evidence had been presented, and now, all that remained was to see if the truth could finally overcome the lies that had bound them all for so long. The day of the retrial arrived with an almost oppressive weight. It wasn't just a day in court. It was the culmination of years of pain, frustration, and betrayal. The entire town had shifted into a state of tense anticipation, and it felt as though every eye in the community was fixed upon the courthouse, waiting for the moment when the truth would finally be revealed. For Marcus, it was the first time in nearly a decade that he felt the kind of hope he thought had been stripped away from him forever. The evidence was irrefutable now. The voices of the people who had come to his aid were louder than ever, and the judge's wrongdoings were no longer buried under layers of legal red tape. For the first time, he had a chance to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Marcus sat in the holding area, his mind racing. He had been through countless motions, hearings, and failed attempts to clear his name. But now, with his exoneration on the horizon, he knew the stakes had never been higher. The room around him felt cold and sterile, but his resolve was warm and steady. He had spent the last decade in a place where survival was everything, where every day was a fight for his dignity, his future, and his humanity. Now, here he was, about to confront the man who had orchestrated the destruction of his life. Judge Thomas O'Malley. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor as the door to the holding room creaked open. It was his attorney, followed by several others, a team of supporters, all working tirelessly to right the wrongs of the past. They were ready, but Marcus wasn't sure if he was. He had been preparing for this moment in his mind for so long, yet now that it was finally here, the weight of it all almost felt unbearable. As the trial began, Marcus took a deep breath and stepped into the courtroom. The air was thick with tension as the spectators filled the benches, murmurs rising as he entered. It had been years since anyone had seen him in this context, not as a prisoner, but as a man ready to reclaim his life. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, some sympathetic, others judgmental. They were all here for one thing: to witness the final unraveling of a case that had captivated their town for so long. Judge O'Malley was already seated, his stern face a mask of authority, though the weariness in his eyes betrayed the tension he was feeling. His pride had carried him for so long, but now it seemed to be crumbling beneath the weight of the truth. The moment the trial began, Emily sat in the back of the courtroom, her heart in her throat. She was here not just as a daughter, but as a witness to a moment of justice, a moment of reckoning for everything her father had done. The prosecution moved quickly, presenting the new evidence, testimonies from the key witnesses who had stepped forward, and a crucial confession from a prison inmate who had witnessed the true criminal's actions. The defense had no real ground to stand on. The facts were indisputable. Marcus's conviction had been a mistake from the start. And now, with the weight of the truth before them, there was nowhere for the judge to hide. Every word in the courtroom felt like a strike against the system that had failed Marcus, and every minute that passed seemed to chip away at the foundation of Judge O'Malley's life. As the case went on, the truth became more and more undeniable. The prosecutor laid out each damning detail of the original trial, showing the ways in which O'Malley had ignored critical evidence and allowed his biases to cloud his judgment. The defense, grasping at straws, could offer nothing that could stand against the flood of evidence and the mounting pressure from the community. The turning point came when the prosecutor called Emily to the stand. Her stomach churned as she took the oath, her hands shaking as she adjusted herself on the witness chair. She had always known that her father's career would eventually come to this, a moment where the world would finally see the truth. But to testify against him, to bear witness to the damage he had caused, was a burden she could hardly bear. She had always believed in her father's integrity, in his ability to judge impartially. But now, standing before the court, she could no longer deny the painful truth. Her father had been wrong. She recounted the events she had witnessed, the evidence she had learned of, and the moment she had confronted her father. The words came slowly at first, the weight of the situation almost suffocating. But as she spoke, something shifted in her, a sense of clarity, a feeling that she was doing the right thing, despite the pain it caused her. Emily's testimony was the final nail in the coffin. The judge, sitting in silence, seemed to shrink before the onslaught of truth. The courtroom had grown quieter with each word, each piece of evidence, until there was nothing left but the cold, undeniable reality of the situation. The judge who had sentenced an innocent boy to prison had now lost everything he had built. The truth, as harsh as it was, had torn away the false layers of justice he had once so easily claimed. In the end, the jury deliberated for only a short time before delivering their verdict. Marcus Lewis was officially exonerated. The courtroom erupted in applause, but for Marcus, the victory was bittersweet. The years he had spent in prison could never be returned, and the life he had dreamed of was still out of reach. But for the first time in his life, he was free. Free from the weight of a false conviction, and free from the man who had wronged him. Judge O'Malley was removed from the bench, his career destroyed. His name, once respected, would now be remembered for the injustice he had done. But the damage was more than just professional. His family, his reputation, everything he had built over the years, had been shattered. Emily, standing outside the courthouse after the trial, felt the full weight of the situation. She had done the right thing by standing up, by telling the truth, but the cost had been enormous. She had lost her father, in a way. The man she had once admired was gone, replaced by a shadow of the person he had once been. Marcus's life, though, had just begun to change. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the road ahead would still be long and fraught with obstacles. The town would take time to heal, and the scars of this injustice would remain, etched in the memories of those who had witnessed it. As Marcus looked around, the weight of everything that had happened settled into his chest. But one thing was clear: he had reclaimed his life. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The aftermath of the trial was not a clear-cut victory, but rather a slow, painful process of reconciliation. In the weeks that followed, Marcus found himself navigating the emotional labyrinth of his newfound freedom. On one hand, he was no longer a prisoner of the system. He was no longer a criminal. But on the other hand, he was carrying with him a lifetime's worth of scars. Memories of confinement, of days lost to an unjust sentence, and the weight of the many years he had spent fighting a system that had turned its back on him. His life, though freed from the bars of a prison cell, was still shackled by the years of trauma. He had dreamed of this day for so long, but the reality of it was far more complicated than he had ever anticipated. The community, too, was left to pick up the pieces. In the wake of the trial, the town was divided, and the rift between the O'Malley family and the rest of the people seemed insurmountable. Some were willing to forgive, to see the judge as a man who had simply made a mistake, a man who had acted on personal bias, but was not beyond redemption. Others were not so forgiving. For them, the damage was irreparable, and the judge's actions were a stain that would never wash away. Emily, caught in the middle, found herself adrift in the storm of public opinion. She had done what she believed was right, but she could not escape the reality that she had just torn apart the life she had known. She had broken a bond with her father that could never be mended. Yet, even in the midst of this chaos, there were moments of clarity. As the days turned into weeks, Emily began to realize that her life, like Marcus's, had been irrevocably altered by the events that had unfolded. She couldn't return to the way things were before. The past was too heavy to be ignored. But she also began to see that she had been part of something larger than herself. Her actions, painful as they were, had sparked a necessary conversation, one that needed to be had if they were ever to heal. Her father's mistakes were not hers to bear, but the consequences of his actions were something she would have to face for the rest of her life. Marcus, meanwhile, was trying to rebuild his life in ways he hadn't imagined possible. He hadn't been able to anticipate the challenges he would face once released from prison. The looks of suspicion from some, the hesitation from others who were unsure how to interact with a man who had been branded as a criminal for so long. But there were also moments of pure kindness. People who had once shunned him, people who had never given him a second thought, now approached him with open arms, eager to make amends for the wrongs of the past. Marcus was still wary, still guarded, but he began to allow himself to heal in small ways, finding solace in the support of a few, the ones who had always believed in his innocence. One of the first things he did after the trial was visit his mother's grave. It had been years since he'd had the chance to mourn her properly. In prison, he had no time for grief. His survival had come first, and everything else had fallen away. But now, standing alone at her gravesite, he finally allowed himself to cry. For all the years he had lost, for the family he had never been able to rebuild, and for the mother who had fought so hard to protect him. The tears were cathartic, a release of all the pain he had kept bottled up inside. The injustice had stolen so much from him, but now, for the first time, he felt as if he had a chance to reclaim something: his dignity, his future, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, he could have the life he had always dreamed of. Emily, too, had moments of quiet reflection, though hers were more conflicted. As she sat alone in her room, going through old family photos, she couldn't help but think back to the girl she had once been. The girl who had admired her father so deeply. The girl who had believed in the justice system with an unwavering faith. But that girl was gone now. The weight of the truth had changed everything, and she no longer saw the world in the same way. She had uncovered the darkness hidden beneath the surface of her father's career, but now she wondered if there could ever be light again. Could she ever forgive him for what he had done? Could she forgive herself for not seeing it sooner? For the O'Malley family, the road to healing would be long and uncertain. The damage had been done, and there was no simple way to undo the harm. But Emily couldn't help but hope that, in time, the wounds might begin to close. She couldn't erase the past, but maybe with patience and a commitment to change, she could begin to build a new life for herself. One that was no longer defined by her father's mistakes, but by her own choices, her own actions. The question was whether she could ever fully step away from the shadow of the man who had shaped so much of her life. For Marcus, the future was still uncertain. He had been freed, but the battle wasn't over. His name had been cleared, but the stigma of his wrongful conviction would linger. There were still those who saw him as a symbol of the failures of the system, and those who believed his fight was just the beginning. Marcus knew that he would have to continue to advocate for justice, not just for himself, but for others who had been wronged by the same system. He had spent too long being a victim of it to sit quietly now. He was determined to use his voice to make sure that others didn't have to suffer the same fate he had. As the months passed, Emily and Marcus crossed paths in unexpected ways. They didn't speak often, but when they did, there was a silent understanding between them. They were both survivors of the same broken system, and though their paths had been shaped by different circumstances, they were bound by the same truth. They had both paid a price, in ways no one could fully comprehend, but they had also gained something invaluable: a deep understanding of the fragility of justice and the strength that comes from confronting it. As the story of Marcus's wrongful conviction became a part of the town's history, people began to reflect on the lessons they had learned. Injustice had been exposed, but so too had the resilience of those who had been wronged. The truth, though painful, had set them free. The question that remained was whether the town would learn from its mistakes, whether it would embrace the difficult process of reconciliation and change. For Emily, the road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear: she would never again be the person she had once been. The woman who had stood by her father's side, unquestioning and loyal, was gone. In her place was someone who had seen the darkness of the system, but had also found the courage to stand against it. The past could never be erased, but the future, she realized, was hers to shape. As Marcus and Emily moved forward, both scared but wiser, the town, too, began its slow, difficult journey toward healing. The battle for justice was never truly over, but they all knew that, somehow, it was worth the fight.